Thanks, Bridget, and thank you to everybody who's here this afternoon. And it's such a pleasure to be able to talk to Kath about her new book. I think Kath is going to talk a little bit first about and show us some images, which I think are incredibly evocative and will help kind of convey some of the flavour of the period. And then she and I are going to have a bit of a chat, and then we'll make sure we've got time for questions. So I'm going to hand over to Kath first, and then we'll come back for our conversation. Thanks, Kath.
Thank you, Bridget, and thank you, Michelle, for that too. So yes, as Michelle said, I've got a bit of a slideshow. Hopefully it sort of suits the 70s theme of tonight for anyone that was a child in the 70s and watched slideshows at home on weekends with their parents. One of the lucky things about this research was the amount of images that I had. We could talk about later that the photographers who were chronicling the period that were around were quite amazing. So the greatest part of my book is about this play called Betty Can Jump. It was performed at the Pram Factory in Melbourne in 1972, and as far as I could tell, it was the first play of the women's liberation movement. And at that time, at the beginning of the Pram Factory, it was a reaction to the really sort of blokey, ocker kind of world of the Pram Factory, where celebrated playwrights like David Williamson were putting on shows like Don's Party, which a lot of the women found very limiting. And this is some detail from the poster. And these nested circles that you can see on the left are made up of, on the outside are the names of the key cast and crew members. On the inside are women who were members of the Australian Performing Group at the Pram Factory, and also women who are part of the Women's Liberation Movement and the Carlton Women's Liberation Group that was emerging at the time. And after John Potts's seminar last week about the death of the author, I think it's kind of a really nice image about they didn't have an author. There was no one great playwright who was credited with their play. There was no, even though there was a director, there was no, directed by. It was a really collective, a collective exercise. And the women's theatre movement that grew out of the Pram Factory, part of this broader group of women's collectives that were part of what's called the cultural renaissance of the second wave feminism, where there were women making films, starting bands, holding art exhibitions, publishing books of poetry and magazines. So in Sydney, there was a film collective. After Betty Can Jump finished a couple of years later at the Pram Factory, the Melbourne Women's Theatre Group started with some of the members that were from there. And one of the things that I wanted to show in this book was Margaret Henderson, the scholar, argued that perhaps a better way of describing these movements of women is not so much a renaissance, but an avant-garde of the 1970s, because in many ways what they were doing was more radical than the men in terms of their breaking down a division between the professional and the amateur, or politics and life and art, and questioning notions about what art could be and what kind of content we could use in art. And they also were really questioning the division between the audience and the cast and the members of the creators. So the Pram Factory did have a very close style of a small theatre where audience members were supposed to become part of the show. But Betty Can Jump took that to another level, with women being invited to come up after the show and talk about their experiences. So you can see here women leaning in during the performance. This is the Pram Factory, which no longer exists. Those of you who know Melbourne well will know it as the place on Drummond Street where a Woolworths and a car park to Lygon Court now is. It was demolished in the early 80s. So the Pram Factory was there from 1970 to 1980, producing hundreds of plays and other activities. They've also, it was a time when a lot of the people in the Pram Factory, part of the Australian Performing Group, were very active in moratorium marches. They were in fact leading some of the marches, dressing up at the front, and they were doing a lot of agitprop factory tours. On the very right here, the woman with the long hair is Yvonne Marini, who was one of the cast members of Betty Can Jump. Just to go back a little bit, I start before the Pram Factory. I start in their university years, and then after university, before the Pram Factory, they moved to the La Mama Theatre, which was around the corner, and they were reading things like the Tulane Drama Review and Overseas Drama Journal, and learning about avant-garde groups from overseas, and doing kind of crazy exercises like falling on the floor and writhing, or turning to the wall and trying to throw their thoughts backwards. Also getting arrested when they performed plays where they swore, and obscenity police would come in and stop plays. This is when they moved into the Pram Factory. So you can see, I think it might be possibly obscured by the, for some of you, depending on how you've got it set up, on the far right, possibly obscured as Graham Blundell, who was one of the founders. Max Gillies with his hands crossed, and in the middle is Evelyn Krape and Claire Dobbin, who, along with Max, were part of the Melbourne Secondary Teachers College that formed one part of the grouping who moved to form the Australian Performing Group, along with a number of people who'd been part of the student theatre movement in Melbourne. So one of these was Bill Garner, who's on the right, who was married to Helen Garner at the time, or just before the Betty Can Jump started. And another grouping that influenced them very early on was a Monash grouping of quite radical leftists who took the Australian Performing Group into a more politicised direction. And obviously they were very influenced by Marxism. Here's the false consciousness sign at the back. Here's Helen, who had, this was Helen Garner before Monkey Group, who was a teacher, a secondary school teacher, frustrated at being left at home while her husband Bill was out most nights rehearsing or at the pub, having a great time at the Pram Factory. There's Kerry Dwyer, who was one of the founders of the Pram Factory, who was frustrated with the limited roles for women, and she was the main catalyst for Betty Can Jump to start. Maggie Helmer, who was an American actress who came just before Betty Can Jump, the Women's Theatre Project began, and taught the women of the Australian Performing Group how she had made a play that was the first women's liberation play in the United States, with a group just outside of Boston next to Harvard University called the Caravan Theatre, another kind of radical avant-garde theatre. Another key figure was Mickey Allen, who produced the set and the slideshows, who was also frustrated in her relationship. This is the cast of the play. And finally, there's a number of things that came out of the Pram Factory. And one of them was famously Circus Oz, and that was founded by a woman, or co-founded by a woman called Laurel Frank, who was a key member of the Betty Can Jump collective, who did a lot of the research, the historical research for the play. Of course, Monkey Group which has a lot of scenes from the Pram Factory and the tower next door where Helen's sort of fictional surrogate visits. Helen was never a formal member of the Pram Factory or the Australian Performing Group, but she was certainly an avid sort of part of the audience, and before that, of course, as part of Betty Kenja. I just put this here because I could see a lot of connection in the parts of the play that Helen wrote in 1972 and some of her later writing, which we may or may not get a chance to talk about. And just finally, the inspiration for the title was a reader that many of you may have used at school. In the 80s, I think it was still being used in the 80s even. John can jump, Betty can jump, and then it goes into a very kind of very gender stereotype storyline of the girl playing with her cat and the boy playing the drum and playing with the trap. So yeah, that's just a bit of an overview. Have I unshared that screen now?
You have.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Kath. That was really, I think those images are so evocative of the period and help us kind of, you know, set the scene for where your story is unfolding. I wonder if you can start by telling us a little bit more, I guess, about the Pram Factory and the Australian Performing Group in terms of that kind of big new wave of Australian theatre in the 1970s. Like, it's a really important era of Australian theatre, and the women kind of emerge almost in opposition to that. But can you just tell us a little bit about the Pram Factory and the Performing Group and the kind of new wave of drama in the 70s in Australia?
Yeah, so like as you've written, Michelle, that they weren't the first Australian sort of playwrights. There were many before that, but from the perspective of those people in the 1960s who were coming out of the university theatre scene, like the people who were there, like Graham Blundell and Max Gillies and the writers Jack Hibbard and John Rummel, they felt like there was nothing, Australian stories weren't being told. The big theatre companies were importing or staging plays that were classical, sort of either Shakespearean plays or the avant-garde sort of plays from Europe and America, but there wasn't an Australian, from their point of view, there was no Australian voice. But also, as you've written, there was the New Left Theatre. I've sort of forgotten the name for a minute. That there was things happening, but it wasn't a vibrant, active culture. So their vision was that we wanted to tell Australian stories. And we wanted to have a place where actors and writers and directors could have this democratic sort of forum where everyone could be, could do anything. Like if you were a stagehand in one show, you got to be the star in the next show. And you know, the stories of Max Gillies cleaning the toilet before he would go on stage. So that there was this belief and a political sort of belief in sort of radical democracy and equality, but the women said, it's not really happening for us. You're bringing scripts with all these roles for men. The men are directing it, the men are writing it. The main writers were Jack Hibbard and John Rummel, and they were great writers. And there was this debate, like, where are the women writers? You know, we don't. They were at home, in Helen's case, looking after Alice.
Yeah. And in some ways too, it's like, it's a lovely way to approach that story of second wave feminism, because in some ways the sort of what happened at the theatre was what happened in the kind of movement in microcosm, you know. So this kind of group of radical, you know, people left, you know, men and women get together, but the women get pissed off because they're kind of excluded from cultural production, or they're excluded from playing kind of leading roles. And so, you know, what ends up happening is these women go and create their own kind of production, which is such a it's a great sort of focus for a story. I know you were thinking when sort of early on in your thesis about what you were kind of hoping to write and what you were hoping to sort of explore in the thesis, I suppose. And, thinking about feminist culture leading on from your MRes thesis, but what was it about Betty Can Jump that made it the right focus for your thesis, and why tell it now? What was important about telling this story at this point?
I think there were lots of things that I just felt like made sense. It had a 50th anniversary coming up, so I knew that would be significant, and it hadn't been, as you were the one that first alerted me to the fact that no one had really written about it. And when I discovered that there were these archives, and I sort of step back a bit. One of the things that I think happens with all of us in academia is tendency to be biased towards the book and the text, and feminist history is no different. And so those stories about the cultural renaissance, which had been talked about for a long time within feminist scholarship, had not been told in any detail because there were very few records. And the history of the Pram Factory had been told primarily as very male history. And the history of feminism had been sort of biased towards the great text, the damned whores and female units. And I just thought this was this gap that had not been told. And I discovered these incredible archives that I got really lucky that the director, Kerry Dwyer, had recorded. Had these amazing notes while she was making the show. And then a couple of years later, she interviewed key cast and crew members in these incredible, frank interviews where they talked about how they felt looking back just at a few years. So their memories would be still fresh, and they were sort of very open and honest with each other about the failures of the show, tensions, and part of the process of their group meant that they could talk about that. And because it was just written on typed up on paper, it wasn't being sent out as a press release. They were amazing records.
That's incredible as a record. I mean, I think, one of the things about Betty Can Jump is that it's often been just relegated to a footnote because the script wasn't published, because it was only performed once. So it was kind of this ephemeral little artifact that kind of disappeared. Whereas, as you say, print culture and books are much more easy for historians and other kinds of scholars to go back to. And I think one of the things about the book that's so great is that you were able to really recover the ephemerality of that performance and the images that you had and the kind of written records that you had. But I guess there are still challenges in doing that. Can you talk about some of the challenges in kind of writing about live performance and kind of recovering live performance that happened 50 years ago?
Yeah, well, I did chase this ghost of a recording that I kept hearing stories about. Someone said, "Oh, yeah, there's a recording in there's a recording in the storeroom," and I think maybe Graham bonded when he's a bit of a story in it, but no one could find it. And in the end, I thought, look, I think people's memories, like a lot of things, and I think challenges that most historians face is that stories change and people's stories do change a bit. But I did find there was a typewritten or Xerox script in the Melbourne State Library of Victoria Pram Factory or Australian Performing Group archives, I should say, with just this message on the front: "Dear Laurel, here is the best surviving record of the play that I've been able to find. Love, Yvonne." So it was as reliable a record of what they said. It's really hard to work out how they staged it because, it was a very much a group creative production, and they did improvise it. Yeah, and people had different memories and things that they'd written at different periods that I recovered. They had changed the story about at other times, so I had to sort of let those sit side by side a little bit.
Yeah. And they must have had a sense of the importance of the work. You know, I mean, there was a lot of feminist activists, I think, are pretty good archivists of their own, activism. But I wondered, I mean, obviously a number of the people that you worked with had kind of kept material, but obviously Kerry Dwyer was the kind of main, she went and did the interviews and all that stuff. So she must have had a sense that this was going to be important in some way, or that it should be preserved in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I'm constantly amazed that she was there as an activist and being a co-founder of the Pram Factory. She was also conscious of keeping those records, but they were great writers, a lot of them, in terms of like the Australian Performing Group had a regular newsletter. I found articles in that. Helen, before, she was Helen Garner, author of Monkey Group. She was already writing in journals like The Digger or Dissent. So she wrote articles that I found in those places. Or I think she forgets a lot of it too. Like she says, "Oh, did I write that?" And there's her name. And yeah, certainly Kerry was very aware of the significance. But Helen, for example, said, why are you so interested in Betty Can Jump?" And when I told her it was the most successful play of that year, it was the best-selling play of 13 shows that the Australian Performing Group put on, she said, "Oh, really? That's amazing." And men said we were just mawkish and sentimental. They kind of turned their noses up at us.
Yeah, that's really interesting that obviously, I mean, for Helen, I suppose, having gone on to do other things, maybe it sits slightly differently in her biography than it does for someone like Kerry, perhaps. But
that's true. Yeah.
I mean, I was wondering too, I mean, you talked about this in your slideshow and that sort of idea of the kind of feminism as a cultural renaissance or as an avant-garde kind of movement. Can you talk a little more about how Betty Can Jump not only was sort of part of that renaissance, but in some ways it kind of seeded a lot of other kinds of work. You kind of touched on that in the slides, but I wonder if you can kind of give us a sense of what Betty helped give birth to in terms of other things that kind of emerged from it.
They all the women I was able to speak to that said, look, it was this incredible moment that gave us a sense of efficacy in our lives and a sense of we could do this. Kerry says, "I knew nothing, so we thought we could do anything." And this kind of power that they have felt being together. And so, for instance, Mickey Allen, who did this set, before Betty Can Jump, we've been in London with her partner, who was also an artist. They were both artists, but he took over the lounge room, and she had this little closet, and he had to move his big paintings to let her in, and said to her, "Look, if you do art too, who's going to make the cup of tea?" So she completely liberated by this show, and is now one of our great visual artists. And who else? There was Laurel, of course, went to found Circus Oz. She was one of the few people that really learnt a lot of the technical skills in the Pram Factory, the lighting and mute and sound, and is still there working in Circus Oz. She's the costume designer into it, ups and downs in it. But one of the other things that they do in the it's not recognised, I think, is that their play from 1972 really preempted, in some ways, the whole saint thesis that we saw in Anne Summers' book. So they were also kind of, not sort of theorists in the traditional sense, but they were people who brought together kind of a activism and art and thinking that I'm sure would have had a huge effect on the audience as well. And there was another attempt to start a women's theatre group 2 years later. But in between time, a lot of the women did go off and said, we're just going to do our shows ourselves. And they developed a new style of working. Although there were always arguments, should we be separatists or should we work with the bigger group and try to change the bigger group, as always happens.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's almost like a Betty Can Jump's one of the first sort of works of feminist history of the sort of new wave, of that kind of second wave of feminism. So it's sort of, I think you're right, and I think you make that argument really nicely, that it's kind of one of the first places that argument is made, and it becomes commonplace to make that kind of claim. But it's really one of the first, I think, to make that point. One of the things that I really liked about the book is the sort of sense of the texture of Carlton, and the way that you put the APG and the performers of Betty in that kind of life of Carlton's countercultural kind of, the sort of texture of all of that in the 1970s. I wonder if you can talk about how you sort of achieve that. It does have a nice sense of lived inness, if you like, of what it was like to be a resident of those places in that time.
Sometimes I think you can achieve that with, I don't feel like I did huge amounts of research, but sometimes you only need a few details, and that can create this whole picture in people's minds. And the other great resource I had was the Australian Performing Group website, which was produced by Sue Ingleton. It's just sort of record of 100 people's memories, and they're great storytellers, and they talk about we had these meetings that would go to 1 o'clock in the morning and be knitting and preparing bikes, and Evelyn Krape would be yelling at the other side of the room to Jack Hibbert about his sexism, but they were actually in a relationship. It was great stories because they were in a relationship at the same time. Really sort of frank and feisty sort of world, and they a lot of them have recorded these great moments, and you didn't, like I said, you need just a few of those to create this world, I think, sometimes.
Yeah. No, I think what I liked about it was that it kind of gave the activism a sense of its sort of lived inness, that this was not just sort of some abstract thing that people were doing. It was part of all the other things that they were doing.
Yeah. And that part of their whole theory of art and life and politics was that there was no division. They literally built, created a door between where a number of the performing group members lived next door to the Pram Factory. So they would sort of tumble out of bed into rehearsal. And there was this kind of, I guess, utopian or sort of Marxist idea. You would not, you should not have a division between work and the sexual revolution was all part of that too. That we could be free in terms of our relationships as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder how all the women, because you interviewed most of the women who were part of the original cast, how did they respond to, I mean, you've talked a little bit about how Helen Garner responded, but I'm just curious about how they all responded to your interest in, very early work for them. And I'm thinking too that, there's been a lot of water under the bridge since 1972. There's been a lot of kind of argy-bargy with sort of intergenerational feminist politics as well. So I'm just wondering, how did they respond to your interest in this early work that they had done?
Yeah, there were different responses. Like Kerry, I think, was really pleased. She said to me, I've been waiting for someone like you to come along to do this, which kind of echoes, I think, what some of the 1970s feminists were hearing from the earlier sort of 40s, and like feminism didn't stop. It's just that there were some women that were still doing things, and when 70s sort of movement built up again, these women were saying, we've always been here waiting for you. So that was a bit of Kerry's response. Part of the problem I had during the interviews, I did more interviews actually after the thesis, because this was half of my thesis that I wanted to turn into a book. So that occurred during COVID. to some extent. So I had to do them by Zoom or phone, and that wasn't ideal. Once I got talking to them, they were mostly warmed up because they realised that my intentions were, you know, celebratory and interested in what they did. But yeah, I think there was a little bit of sensitivity. Helen was slightly. She said, "Look, I don't think I can offer you anything because I just don't remember in that period." But once and also, I think probably because of the history of the first stone, which I was quite open with her that I was part of younger women in that period. This is not this is a genuine project that I'm really interested in you. And I said to her, I saw her at a book event not so long ago, and I realised that what happened with the first stone is that you were the age that I am now, looking at us, and now I'm sort of reversing things, looking at your generation in your 20s when I'm the age you were writing stone. So, I think once I got to talk to them in more detail, I think they just loved that I wanted to remember what they did, or what they did.
Yeah.
If that's, I think, is that the question that you were?
Yeah, I think so. I was just curious about, I mean, you know, there's always the interview, and then there's the sort of stuff that happens around the interview, I suppose.
Yeah.
And all that's so important to the ways that it kind of goes, the way the frame, you know, that kind of, if someone's excited to speak to you, or if they're like, oh, why do I want to talk about this thing I did 50 years ago, or, you know, all of that. I just thought there's something kind of interesting too.
Yeah. No, mostly I think that they were happy, but it was quite stressful because it is history, and it is history of people that were still alive. So when I came close to finishing the manuscript, I did give it to the key women who I extensively, and that was a bit mostly fine. There was like, you know, this person had brown hair, not black hair, or most people accepted that things that other people had different memories of, you know, that was all acceptable. Helen wanted to change some quotes to make them look more, change words here and there, not to change the meaning, but like, this will sound better. Claire Dobbin had some, she's a script writer now, so she had quite a lot of like change, extensive changes. So they all had their different personalities, their reaction to it.
So you basically had a lot of different, like, high quality copy editing in some ways going on. Helen Garner reading your work and saying, this will sound better. That's
that was so anxious. There was one passage that I inserted late that was a bit of a mess, and she just my advice, take it out, start again.
Fair enough, you know. I was going to ask you too about the first stone, and you know, because you talk about this in the book, that you are writing this from a particular subject position. You were in Melbourne at the time of the first stone controversy, you know, that was sort of part of that sort of third wave feminist identity, I suppose, which in some ways was a bit of a critique of the second wave, a mother-daughter struggle, or whatever. That, you know, there were lots of different interpretive lenses put on that question, I suppose. And a lot of women, you know, who were in their 20s in that period around the first stone really dislike Helen Garner, and you know, won't read her other work because of what went on during that period. I was wondering how and you kind of work through this in the book, but I was just wondering how your position in that original controversy, or that your relationship to that controversy, sort of shaped your approach to this material, like those complex intergenerational feminist politics. I wonder if you could just unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a good question. I tried to separate it in one sense, in that there were different stories and different times, but I think part of my approach was influenced a bit by the scholar Claire Hemmings, who critiques the idea of in her book Why Stories Matter. We need to have a feminist get over the feminist generational problem, and that we have this tendency to tell feminist history as this sort of progress to either ever more sophisticated sort of analysis on the one hand, or another sort of version of history of like losing our radicalism. And then look, neither of these ways of telling history are very useful. And I always also tried to keep that in mind. And I actually went back and reread the Stone and realised, even though I didn't agree with some of her conclusions in that, I realised how much of the way I read it at the time was framed by the media, which had come out before the book was even released, that framed it as a generational battle, which I think exaggerated what she was doing in the first Stone and caricatured and simplified it a lot. But certainly affected the way I read it at the time, and because of the emotions at the time. So yeah, I think I had a more detachment and less emotion. It was good. It felt cathartic in a way too, to have that meeting with her, where we didn't really talk that much about it, but when we did, it was kind of we are sort of coming to some understanding, if not agreement on everything.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it's that the 50th anniversary was the right time to write this account. You know, like 30 years might not have been. You know, the sort of tensions around the first Stone controversy. 50 years on, I think, you know, things are different, and I think the kind of feminist politics are different, and that sort of intergenerational stuff is not so significant as it once may have seemed, perhaps. So I think there's something different about the way that we as younger women relate to the second wave, I think.
Now, do you think so?
Yeah, I feel like it's quite different there. And I feel like it's interesting that there is, you know, there seems to me to be a lot of interest from younger scholars in reevaluating and kind of excavating aspects of second wave feminism from the 1970s, you know, in a way that I think up until the 90s, a lot of that scholarship was probably written by people who had been participants in that movement. And that's still the case, I think, to some extent. But I wonder why do you think there has been a kind of turn back to the 70s in kind of feminist scholarship, or in a renewed interest in that period?
Oh, look, I think your book about the 70s sort of answers that. I'm not sure if I'm reading too much into it, but I think that idea of this time of hope and radicalism, and that we could really change things is appealing. And you know, that's the last moment, I think, when for a lot of people, I think that things could have gone in a different way, or and you know, I guess thinking, well, if we need this kind of change again, maybe we need to think to what could have happened and didn't happen, or you know, the lessons maybe that we could have learnt. And it's that sort of period of great change, and so many changes. It's just inherently dramatic and exciting to research.
And I think particularly for something like Betty Can Jump, the sort of sense that they really did think they were, you know, that there was this sense of endless possibility because they were creating something from scratch. There's something kind of exciting, I think, about that too, to not be, you know, having to worry about how you're just making it up, and it's kind of fun, and there's something fresh about that too, which is kind of exciting. So I think that sense of possibility is really seductive, and you capture it really beautifully. I think this sort of sense that they had of we were just creating as we, you know, making it up as we went along and making something new, which is, you know, it's exciting. Look, I wonder if we might open up to questions. I still have some more things if others don't have questions, but I thought I would make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So I'd like to just throw it open and see if people would like to. You can just raise your hand in the little your little emojis, or you can write it in the chat, but probably because it's not a huge group, you can just pop your hand up and we can go from there. I'm going to ask Bridget has a question, and then I can ask my other question.
Thanks, Michelle and Kath. This has been so fascinating. I have lots of questions, so I might have to contain myself. Just a really sort of basic one to begin with, which is you mentioned doing more interviews for the book during the period of COVID. How different is the book from the thesis?
Oh, that's a really good question. So the story was really half of my thesis, and they were a similar length. So I really needed a lot more material. But in terms of style and structure, I wrote my thesis originally because my background as a journalist, with the story foregrounded and the argument sort of trailing the story. So the argument was there, but the story led, and I had to rewrite that to let the argument lead and let the story serve the argument. So it meant it was less chronological than the book, even though the book isn't strictly chronological. But I let the some of the theory fall back a bit because I wanted to write for a general audience, and it was probably more anecdotal in some ways. It was more, I just was more conscious of the what would make a good story, as opposed to this will serve my academic argument. And I also put myself in the book too, because I wanted to do some creative nonfiction, and I felt like there were reasons why most people do a PhD that are often personal. And to me, it was about also sort of that moment when my generation was born and the world was changing. I thought that would make a more interesting book to sort of be honest about why you were writing it. So does that answer?
Look, it does. Thanks, Kath. And if I could sneak in a second question, which is about, was there ever any subsequent attempt to do another production of the play? I mean, it kind of seems to me that 1975, the International Year of Women, just would have been a really beautiful moment for this. Were there any such discussions or possibilities?
There was some talk about that. Kerry says there was a woman, an Indigenous actor in Sydney, who talked to her about it, but it was so of their particular moment, those months and weeks. A lot of the performance grew out of a consciousness raising that the women were doing. So it was a mix of historical research into sort of women like Vida Goldstein and Carolyn Chisholm, and very personal things that the women, the cast, were developing through consciousness raising and improvisation. So it didn't, and the staging was quite complex. It didn't really lend itself to being just a script that anyone could pick up. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. I might throw in a question if we don't have another one from our group, but I will, of course, there's still time to ask other questions. I was wondering, you showed in the slides, you put up Helen Garner's most recent diary, you know, the collection, the edited diaries, which are just, I mean, that book is just incredible. It's such an amazing, you know, propulsive kind of incredible book. And you mentioned that you were kind of struck in some ways by there are some similarities you thought between some of her later work and, you know, Betty Can Jump. And of course, she hadn't published anything beyond essays and things like that when she was involved in the writing of Betty Can Jump. I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit and what sort of similarities you saw.
Well, she was she wrote a monologue in Betty Can Jump about being a woman with her sort of hands in the knee deep, and I think she's wet shit, and like very Helen Garner sort of she's talking to a man saying, "You despise me because I'm, you know, wrapped up in my children and my domestic work, and you hate coming home and hearing about my labours." And all these things repeat again in her diary 25 years later when she's living with Murray Vale, and he's making the same accusations, and you want me to leave the house every day to be, you get so many parallels. And there's also this scene in Betty Can Jump where she talks about feeling like they had to do a improvisation as a woman I feel like, and finish the sentence, and her feeling was that she felt like a glittering, amongst super academic men, I feel like glittering blade, and I don't dare to pull it out because I would stab and stab and stab. And I started seeing all these knives in Helen's work, and there's this scene where she uses that exact same phrase in her diary. I stabbed and stabbed and stabbed. She finally discovered that third husband is having a relationship.
Yeah.
It was just fascinating to see these constants over the decades that writers can have in their sort of the motifs and the obsessions and even the words that they're using. And,
that's incredible, because and in terms of, because that work is not published too, you're probably one of the few who's read both of them, in that sense. So it's quite extraordinary. I was wondering too if I could ask you a little bit more about your kind of position as you said, you wanted to do some creative nonfiction, and so having yourself in the text was an important part of that. You're kind of the investigator, you're the narrator, you're kind of part of the story. And I suppose there's also some moments of reflection, about yourself in the story. And I wonder, if you could talk a little bit more about the kind of the purpose of that kind of, because I think it works really beautifully, because I think often that sort of stuff about motivation and why I'm writing this book tends to be elided in historical works. It's often, maybe it's in the acknowledgements or maybe it's somewhere, but it's very much embedded into the text in this book. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how you achieved it and what you were hoping to advance with that.
Well, it's a little bit tricky because a lot of the research was done while I was doing my PhD, where I wasn't sort of thinking like a nonfiction writer in terms of like taking notes. When I met Kerry Dwyer while I was doing my PhD, I was listening to what she was saying, and I was sort of observing. But if I was writing a nonfiction book at that point, I probably would have gone away.
Written down what she was wearing, and you would be like talking about the meeting in the room and what it was like.
So I had to sort of retrospectively add a little bit of that on. I had interviewed Helen afterwards, and that was interesting. Going to Melbourne to do that did open more doors to write differently, because on that trip I went and sort of revisited places that sort of drew a lot of the setting together, and my own sort of life in Melbourne as an early in my early adult years, and that just seemed to work a bit more naturally in terms of seeing how I could write the story a little bit differently, or tie it all up in a more creative nonfiction way. I'm not sure if I always succeeded in that. It was a little bit of like some of my thesis work was sitting with my more journalistic or creative essayist sort of style of work. But I mean, in a sense, that's what creative nonfiction can be.
Yes, exactly.
Which
was more fun to write, the kind of creative nonfiction part, or the kind of more conventional thesis part?
It was maybe more enjoyable as a writer, being able to sort of have some more freedom. But I just learned how much I loved the archival research, like that sort of it. That was so much more satisfying than any work that I'd done before as a journalist. Like always been sort of so superficially investigating things before, and so I definitely think that experience of being able to have all that time as when I was doing my PhD was just unprecedented, and I imagine that's what a lot of people experience while they're doing it.
Yeah, fantastic. I think Bridget has her hand up.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, Kath, just following on from the issue of sort of archival research, I was wondering if any of the material that you looked at has, as a result of you uncovering this material, if it's actually made its way into any public repository at the State Library of Victoria or the Performing Arts Centre, sort of thinking about the kind of big legacies that in your book.
Well, look, I mean, one thing I should probably do is table all my old recordings, but they were all already there. Apart from well, Kerry Dwyer's papers were at the New South Wales State Library, but they weren't processed. So I had to ask permission for those because they had just been they'd actually been through a few libraries and no one had properly posited them. So I think I discovered they were there simply by tracking Kerry down, and she said, "Oh yeah, I've got these papers, and they're at the State Library. They haven't been properly sort of processed yet. So I don't know if they still have."
Hopefully by now. Might have put them in.
They're calling them a strange name. They had them under a sort of misleading name, and I tried to correct the name. It's an even worse name. Anyway.
I think Kate has a question.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm keeping my video off. We've got connection issues here at home, so just hear my voice. I've just appreciated this so much, Kath. I mean, I love your book. It's such an accomplishment. And Bridget asked earlier the question I was going to ask about that transition from thesis to book. And then, Michelle, I really appreciated your question of teasing out from Kath, just that that sort of personal writing that she's got in there. And I guess that's what I want to pick up on and just ask you more in terms of the fact that the book has a kind of more active I presence, like the narrating I is just got a bigger presence in that book, obviously, than it did in the thesis for obvious reasons. What do you think it is doing in epistemologically different by doing that? Because it is something else is happening there. And I think which cannot be explained by saying something like, one of my pet hates is when people say it makes something relatable, which is just the most idiotic thing. And it's, of course, what does that even mean anyway? And it's so reductive and odd as a thing to say. And that is not what your book is doing. Like, it's not about relatability. So what is it? What is it when that I-ness is more present? What does it do to knowledge claims and to investigations? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Okay, I feel like you're more qualified than anyone to answer that in a way. I'd be really interested to hear what you think it does. But
I don't have an answer at the ready, Kath. It's okay. It's just a genuine question.
I guess one of the reasons I wanted to use the I, apart from I think making it I wanted to be honest about why I was following this story, and it seemed disingenuous not to be honest about your own investments. But I guess it does what I hope good scholarship does in one sense, in that it makes it clear that you are coming from a position, and hopefully that's what feminism, good feminist scholarship does. It acknowledges, it sort of has always critiqued this idea of this disembodied, abstract thinking subject. So in a way, maybe it's enacting that by saying, well, I am just one person that asked these questions, found these things, and these are the conclusions or the observations that I had.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Thanks, Kath.
But but Kate, you've written about the use of the I too, as the sort of the anti-New Yorker voice too, which I found very fascinating. That not just the New Yorker is a sort of a certain kind of voice, isn't it, that you were critiquing.
Yeah, I mean, it's effective, it's amazing, but it's not going to be useful for in every context.
Yeah. Wow. And what next, Kath? What's the next project?
That's a good question. I'm really looking for, I mean, it was such an amazing find in archives, and I'm feeling like, where will I ever find such a great set of archives again? I've been thinking about one of the women, Laurel Frank, has been sort of kept whispering in my ear, saying the Circus Oz archives are like being processed now and sent to the State Library of Victoria. And I like that idea too, but it's also like, I find it difficult at this point to say, what do you want to commit yourself to, or how, you know, how also could you do that? I can think how the only way I was able to do this was through the scholarship, and I got a couple of small grants to finish the book. So it's a matter of how do you replicate something like that again, both in terms of content and practically. Yeah. So if anyone has any great ideas or archives that they don't want to use, I'm all open to ideas.
That sounds like a State Library of Victoria fellowship project to me. That would be great. As a starting point anyway. But look, you know, we'll all be keen to read what you do next, because the book is just wonderful. So it was such a pleasure to be able to talk to you about it today.
What a great note to end on. So thank you so much, Kath, and congratulations on the book. Think of this as a kind of an extra launching of the book. And thanks very much, Michelle, for visiting us and being such an engaged and informed discussant.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So, thank you to Chris Muller, who organised today, but teachers at the time. Thanks, colleagues, for coming, and we'll be convening again in 4 weeks' time, 26th of April, when I think we have Peter Doyle talking about suburban noir. So see you all then. Thanks, everyone. I'll end the meeting now.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Pleasure.